Okay, folks, I think we're gonna start, and people will catch up with us as they can. Welcome from wherever you are coming to us in the world today. This is our session, Gene Editing and Agroecology, Reframing the Debate on Food System Transition. My name is Pat Thomas, and I'm a director of Beyond GM and A Bigger Conversation. I've just got a few opening thoughts before we get going, and that is wherever you sit on the spectrum of potential solutions, I think the one place that we can all agree is that agriculture is in need of transformation. And the big question is, what direction will that transformation take? And while many of us believe that agroecology is the most rational and planet-friendly paradigm shift, there is a growing and powerful narrative presenting technological solutions as essential to addressing sustainability, biodiversity, and climate change challenges. And the technologies that we're talking about today are biotechnologies, and in particular newer forms of agricultural genetic engineering like gene editing, gene drives, and synthetic biology, and where these technologies fit into the future of agriculture. It's a topic that continues to divide people. As part of our work, Beyond GM's A Bigger Conversation looks for ways to bridge those kind of divides. We engage with a wide range of individuals from all along the belief spectrum. And what we've observed is that at each end of that spectrum, there are people who are equally intelligent and equally passionate about both agroecology and genome editing. But most people sit somewhere in the middle, recognizing that technology has a place and endeavoring to understand what that place is and who gets to decide what mix of technologies is used, and if and whether and how such radically different approaches might exist together in the future. This notion, which is sometimes called pluriformity or coexistence, has a sort of warm, liberal, collegiate vibe to it. But the reality is that coexistence, if it can be achieved at all, is going to be hard. It requires limits and boundaries and regulations and legal remedies in order to ensure that one type of farming doesn't negatively impact on another type of farming. And we know of nowhere in the world where this is being addressed in a proactive and productive way. And of course, all this is happening within a wider context of the policy landscape and how food and farming is changing and developing. And that wider context is the notion of what's been called a biodigital convergence, a blurring of the lines between the biological, the synthetic, and the digital worlds that is being described in some places as the fourth industrial revolution. And within this landscape, our food is increasingly being described in terms of software, and our farms in terms of data banks. And this language is the language of no limits, no boundaries, and as we are beginning to see in some countries, no regulation. In most policy scenarios for this landscape, the concept of agroecology rarely warrants a mention. And when it does, it's often the last item on a long list of other more techy solutions, or as the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization's 2030 strategy sees it, agroecology is a doorway through which these biogenetic and biodigital tools can enter the wider farming system. And for those who believe that agroecology is the only viable paradigm shift, this is hard to hear, and it must be heard because it must be engaged with, because paradoxically, a lack of engagement doesn't shut the door. Instead, it opens it a little bit wider. And so what we're looking at today is a way to begin to engage with this topic through the lens of the principles and practices of agroecology. And our panel today is full of fabulous people who are more than capable of providing some context for sharpening our thinking, for talking about potential consequences, and for having a robust discussion about how agroecological principles might gain greater prominence and help define what technologies we use and how we use them. So in a minute, I'm going to ask the panel to introduce itself. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. We're following a more conversational format today. So if you have tuned in hoping to see lots of PowerPoints, you're out of luck. It would greatly help us if you could put any specific questions to the panel in the Q&A box using the Q&A button, which will be either at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on what device you're using. The chat function is also enabled, and you are welcome to connect with us and with each other using that as well. My colleague Lawrence Woodward will be monitoring both of those feeds and feeding your thoughts and questions back to our panelists. And we are recording this session, and the recording will be posted on our YouTube playlist, and we'll let everybody know about that too. You'll see at the very top of the chat box, I've posted a link to a downloadable document with some suggested further reading, which includes work by all of our panelists. And I've also posted our Twitter handles to ourselves and to our panelists. So if you're tweeting at all today, please do acknowledge us. And this is where I start to take a little bit more of a back seat. I'm going to ask each of our panelists in turn to introduce themselves and also to sort of briefly address the question of whether agroecology really is the necessary paradigm shift in food and farming, and is it the only paradigm shift in food and farming that we need? And I'd like to start, please, with you, Chantal.
Sure, thanks. So good morning, afternoon, perhaps evening for some of you. So my name is Chantal Clément, and I'm the Deputy Director of IPES Food, which is the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And we really work to push for a sort of policy-oriented food systems transformation. I also recently published an article with Francesca Yen, who's also on this call, really on this topic, particularly developing a framework to assess new technologies like gene editing on the basis of the FAO's 10 elements of agroecology. Essentially, what we found was that this, and we can talk about it more in detail later, but that these 10 elements could really serve as a holistic assessment tool when we're considering new technologies and food systems. So going far beyond gene editing and considering any new innovation, any new technology, using that as a framework, because we still didn't believe that we quite have the adequate benchmark to do that today. And maybe to answer your second question on agroecology, I think it's been said time and time again since last spring, and we've probably all been on way too many webinars saying these same things, but the whole world was really finally made to confront lingering challenges in food systems. We saw what happens when long global supply chains are disrupted. We also saw the power of territorial markets, of local eating, of strengthening ties between producers and consumers. I think we've all firsthand really seen this imperative that we all have now to try to get to more sustainable food systems, because we know these issues will keep cropping up. This is not our last global crisis. And so I think we were all sort of confronted with that reality. And probably that being said, we then have agroecology that's increasingly talking about transformation that can really deliver benefits across all dimensions of sustainability. So we're not just talking about environment, and Pat, you said this already, we're talking about environment, socioeconomic changes, governance issues as well. So really agroecology for me goes beyond the agronomic, because it's really a paradigm that aims to tackle the root causes of many of the current issues we have in our food systems and also the inequalities. So I think agroecology really just shows us to think in a more integrated way, in a comprehensive way about food systems issues, also in a way that's more participatory. And I think probably others can speak to agroecology better than I can, but I think right now certain groups are perhaps a bit more skeptical or even fearful of agroecology as a paradigm, because it does go beyond just what you do on the farm. It's really a sort of solution that has encompassing and sort of radical ways of thinking about the food system, especially I think around the governance and the socioeconomic pieces of this. And I think that can be, change is always intimidating. Big transformation is always hard to accept. So I think that's why we have to have this dialogue and try to reconcile a lot of these divergent opinions. Thanks.
Thank you, Chantal. Chris, I'd like to come to you next, please.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Chris Mage. I am a small-scale farmer, veg grower based in Somerset in the west of England. Prior to that, I've been doing that for the last 20 odd years. Prior to that, I have a background in academic social science. I published a book recently called A Small Farm Future. The publishers came up with a subtitle to try and encompass what the book was about, which the subtitle is Making the Case for a Society Built Around Local Economies, Self-Provisioning, Agricultural Diversity and a Shared Earth. So I guess that puts me pretty firmly in a kind of agroecology camp. I mean, I think there's a, you know, as with all of these things, you start to, you know, agroecology, it's a bit like a word like sustainability. It starts meaning all things to all people. So, you know, that's sort of part of what the debate is about. But I guess, you know, in the book, I basically argue that, as I see it, you know, in view of the numerous intersecting biophysical and social, economic, political crises that we face globally, the best way forward, as I see it, is a kind of low carbon, labour and skills intensive, small scale local farming that's oriented and primarily to that's kind of driven by farmers themselves and the communities, the local communities that they serve, kind of defining their needs and defining the kind of food systems that they want. So I've possibly been one of the sorts of people that Pat was referring to, that, you know, I've been sort of on the ground with my hands in the soil, sort of maybe being slightly willfully ignoring some of the sort of big biotech stuff that's kind of coming down the pipe. So, you know, I haven't focused, that hasn't been a fundamental focus of my work. I mean, I think more or less being human, you know, more or less anything that people do is technologically, we cannot, is technological. We cannot not be technological. But I'm kind of interested in how technologies may either serve or obstruct that kind of low carbon labour and skills intensive local vision. So I guess that's where I'm coming from in this conversation, and, you know, we'll be interested to hear different perspectives. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Francesca.
Hi, everyone. Sorry. My name is Francesca Yen. I was previously working for IPES Food with Chantal, and I recently left to let's say become an independent consultant, and now working for IFAD, not absolutely representing IFAD in this conference. And I was previously working also for the Green Party of Belgium as a policy advisor on food and agriculture. So that's pretty much. And yeah, indeed, we had worked together with Chantal on top of our duties with IBES on this article, using the 10 elements to assess the compatibility of GM with agroecology, following discussions that we had. And there was a quite useful exercise to see, also I'm also replying to your first question or topic of discussion, but it was actually interesting because there was an exercise that kind of helped me to understand how much we actually need instruments, tools, and frameworks to actually use agroecology as the paradigm shift that we need. We have lots of discussions, I think very interesting, passionate, vibrant discussions about agroecology, about how much we need to transform food systems. Everyone pretty much agree, also in big institutions and let's say more business as usual oriented organizations. But we really need to have, I think now, a discussion on what are the benchmarks, what is the framework, what are the indicators that we need to achieve that transformation. So we tested out the 10 elements, and it worked quite well, I think, in that first exercise, and we used CRISPR and GM as an example to do that, because it was a quite emblematic one. So that would be, I think, my first contribution. It's really like, we need, if we want to talk about agroecology, we really need to set what are the benchmarks, what are the indicators, what are the frameworks that we are looking at. Recently, the CFS published, as we all know, pretty much the policy recommendation on agroecology, and then one, I think my favorite one was the one mentioning the tape, which is a tool published by the FAO to measure the transformation of farms towards agroecology. The recommendation is to use the tape also as a policy instrument, as a policy tool. So, for example, subsidies in an ideal world could be allocated according to the level of transfer of agroecological transformations. It's a very practical tool, and these are, I think, the things that we need in order to start the transformation. And yeah, one other thing I wanted to say very briefly for this introduction is that I think that one of the things that we need to address is that agroecology is sort of a comprehensive term that really embrace and mean a lot of things for a lot of different people. And maybe, I don't know, it's really a matter of the term itself. I mean, it's agroecology. Agro comes from I think it was the countryside for the Roman, the agro Romano. It's a Latin word, and it really means like the link with the field. But when we are talking about agroecology, we are also talking about land tenure. We're also talking about short supply chain. We're talking about a lot of different things that sort of indeed are connected with this transformation of food systems. So maybe one of the reflections that we need to have is really on the term. Do we need agroecology, or what do we mean for agroecology, or do we need like a sort of broader term? Because indeed we are all talking about this big transformation that we need. Over, thanks.
Thank you, Francesca. Maiwa, can we come to you next, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Maiwa Montenegro, and I'll add DeWitt because I'm part Peruvian and part Dutch, so I carry my mother's last name as the hybrid that I've always embodied. And I'm calling in today from unceded Cherokee land in what is now called Tennessee. I work as an assistant professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz on a Waswas-speaking Uipi tribe territory. And I was trained as a molecular biologist in undergrad, and initially about 20 years ago thought that I would be working on biotechnology as a career. That was my intended pathway. I took a turn as a journalist for about 7 or 8 years during the outbreak of the global food crisis in 2008, 2009. And during the course of that reporting, I was young and very had really no fear about just cold calling lots of famous people who I thought had written interesting things. So I would get in touch with Nina Fedorov, who was at that time science advisor to Secretary Hillary Clinton, a plant biologist, very excited about the possibility of expanding GMOs to feed the world, especially places like Africa. I talked to people like Raj Patel, who had a very different understanding of what the underlying root causes of the food crisis were. And I had a bit of an existential crisis. Like I was trying to write things that I felt like I didn't really understand well enough to put words onto the page. So long story short, I made my way back to university, and now I'm a professor of the social dimensions of agroecology at UC Santa Cruz, where I work on a variety of things related to food sovereignty, the knowledge politics around agroecology. And as an Indigenous person, I'm always very interested in epistemologies and ontologies, how we know about things, whose expertise matters. In fact, what paradigms are we using to understand the world? What values and priorities are embedded in the food systems that we shape, produce, and create, and technologies as a part of that are deeply political and embedded in politics. They are not neutral, which is what I think one of the challenging things about a debate like this often centers tools as mere practices, as mere even management tools that we could somehow put together. Like in theory, yes, you could put a gene edited seed into a polyculture system, but that says very little about the historic lock-ins of knowledge, technology, rules, regulations, institutions, entire political economies that have gone down one pathway towards a kind of modernization that, from an Indigenous perspective, has always been boxed into the house that modernity built, based on universal reason, based on a foundation of separability of humans and non-human organisms, for the affirmation of global capital and accumulation. So I am very interested, partly because of that ontological reason, and partly because of the way that different actors in this space see whose knowledge matters quite differently. And I think in my time as a researcher looking at gene editing, which I did for my postdoc, I encountered so many very, very thoughtful individuals who are working on plants and crops. And one of the hard things, and I'd like to continue discussion today, is in terms of that, what we call participatory space, and understanding whose knowledge is reflected and produced in technologies. I saw real limitations of how that's actually being put into practice. I see, excuse me, recognition that inclusion matters, and there's a kind of politics to inclusion. All the Black and brown people, all the Indigenous people, they should be at the table. But unfortunately, that table is often constructed and set with a very specific agenda already in place. So I'll just end my thoughts there. Probably could talk to you for 10 years here, but thank you. I appreciate being welcomed with a bunch of folks whose work I very much admire. So thanks, Pat.
Thank you, Maiwa. Nettie, I'm going to come to you next.
Good morning from Saskatchewan, Canada. I'm Nere Weave. I'm an organic farmer on what in our context is a small scale prairie farm, mixed grains, pulse crops, lentils, that is, and cattle. We've been certified organic for some decades, but we started out earlier on as what's called conventional farmers, but I would say chemical farmers, to be more precise about the language. And we made the transition because we were concerned about ecological issues. We were concerned about how our farming is damaging the life webs around us. And my own academic background is in philosophy, ethics, actually. So my questions around agroecology and around ways of thinking about agriculture are very much embedded in who we are in this context and what our responsibilities are. And it seems to me that we're very prone, particularly in Western industrialized contexts, we're very prone to limit the problems, to reduce the questions even, and certainly reduce what counts as appropriate answers, as knowledge, in such a way that we can control it. But my sense is that we are, how should I say, we are not nearly humble enough about what our place is within life webs, and we misunderstand and actually don't know nearly enough about what else is living around us and how it interacts to be using the very powerful technologies. And the ethical question around these powerful technologies, like gene editing, is the consequences and who's accountable for the consequences, whose responsibility is it? And my sense is that we've divided that question into the scientific knowledge, where the science is in some ways considered neutral, ethically neutral. They're just giving us the facts. And then the rest of us as farmers or food producers are somehow the recipients of this knowledge. And that puts us in a very, and I want to say a little more about this later, but that puts us in a socially and politically very difficult place when we object, when we say, actually, we may not know about genetic engineering, but we know something else about how calving is going, how the wheat problem is overwhelming us, or we know something about our soils that is very specific and doesn't count as knowledge. So I just want to say that in terms of where my positioning here is, I think we need to be cognizant of how little we know and how responsible we are for the destruction around us. We do know that. We know that systems are collapsing. Biodiversity is in deep trouble in many parts of our ecological systems. So when we go back to the question of agroecology, it seems to me what we need to do is speak not about one system, but speak about ways of that relationships with our surroundings, both social and certainly ecological, are shaped, and maybe talk about agroecologies, how we live humbly and well in our context. I stop there.
Thank you, Nettie. Jim, last but not least, please introduce yourself.
Sure, what a wonderful group of people to have to follow. My name is Jim Thomas. I'm the research director with the Etc. Group. We're a small international organization that tracks new and emerging technologies, corporate power, and strategies of corporations around the food systems. And yeah, we work on issues of governance, we work on issues of the food system, and definitely we support the turn to agroecology. Well, it's not really a turn. I think you talked about it as there's a need for transformation in agriculture. In many parts of the way in which people grow and create food, there isn't a need for transformation. These are systems that have fed people for a long time, and recognizing that and supporting that is extremely important. Certainly CRISPR is something we've been looking at for many years. Not obviously CRISPR's only been around since about 2013, but it was previously called intragenics, and part of a broader sort of set of innovations in biotech called synthetic biology, which we track at the Convention on Biological Diversity and elsewhere. I am very glad, Pat, that you brought up sort of the bigger picture, and I really welcome this opportunity to think about beyond GM. This is the BioDigital shift that's going on right now, that we're moving into a very different vision by agribusiness and by technological decision makers, and that we have to situate our conversation within that. And I'm really enjoying listening to Maiwa and to Nettie and others about the sort of the bigger need to think about how knowledge is produced, how technologies are assessed. I think as much as saying, do we think agroecology is the right way to go to assess our food systems, I think technology assessment is the right way to go for how do we govern our food systems as technology moves center stage. And whether we're assessing against the principles of agroecology, or I'm thinking about the 6 pillars for food sovereignty that were developed at Nyalini 15 years ago. Next year we're going to have the third Nyalini gathering of social movements, of peasant movements. I think what's most important is that we develop the frameworks by which we assess, and we ask our governments to assess how the food system is developed. So I think that's a very good step.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. And I join Jim in saying what a fantastic group of people. And I'm already regretting how short a time we will have together today. Just to let our panelists and our audience know, we are planning on spending some time in the last half hour, 40 minutes or so of this session on asking audience questions. So for audience and panel, what you don't get in now, you can probably get in then. Yes? Okay, so we've got some specialists here who I would like to sort of call on for the next couple of sections, really to sort of set the scene. And I wanted to pick up a little bit, Maiwa, on what you were saying about paradigm shifts and what have you. I think you are in a real position to talk about how tech entrenches old paradigms. And if you'd like to start with saying something on that, I'd be grateful.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I thought a lot about this question and came up with about 5 different answers, but for the sake of concision, I thought I would maybe talk about the ways that these entrenchments can happen in very different ways, like regionally and geographically. So for example, in the United States or other highly industrialized contexts, it's often very hard to see the entrenchment because of these path-dependent processes. So we look around the world today and everything seems like we use the language conventional. It seems very normal. Nettie had to say, like, I'm going to call it chemical, or I'm going to call it industrial, to remind people that this is not convention, or it hasn't been historically. At the same time that these path-dependent processes have really subsidized green revolution style agriculture via kind of invisible trade rules, farm bill policies, and an entire apparatus of research, education, and development. In that pathway, we have simultaneously underinvested and underdeveloped others. And there's a beautiful paper that I often like to call attention to. Let me see if I can, Van Lokeren and Barrett, I can put a link in the chat, 2009. And they actually work through how when you develop on one path, you're systematically kind of siphoning resources from another pathway. In the University of California system, we saw this, I think, very evocatively, very concretely, in the way that there was a world-class program for biological control. You know, Miguel Altieri and others who were famous for understanding the role of insects and the relationships of beneficial insects predating on what we call pests. That pathway had staff, it had, you know, research centers, it had land not very far from campus. And through the 1980s, as the university system started to invest more in molecular genetic approaches, more in the basic sciences, and we were like, the applied stuff, that's for industry, right? We're going to use the National Science Foundation monies to go more towards basic science and cleaving the division of labor of pure and applied. What we saw happen was a really tragic dismantling of an entire apparatus of agroecological science, research, development that is hard to see in hindsight because we don't know. It was one of those things that a pathway untaken. And just to speed things up a little bit, I think things are playing out very differently in Africa. I'm not an Africanist scholar, but I think that is really ground zero for where a potential elaboration of agroecology based on indigenous African knowledge and peasant agriculture could have the potential to flourish. It is also the place that is the focal point for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for AGRA, for the UN Food System Summit, which I see there's some interest in the Q&A. And as my colleague, Timothy Wise likes to say, really there, it's not so much about gene editing. Gene editing is kind of a lever to open up the door to integrate small farmers into global commodity supply chains, to get them introduced into seeing seeds as inputs that they then must purchase into the fertilizers, into the pesticides. So I could go on, but I think there the stakes are really huge for how we are talking about and envisioning these entrenchments, because there are some places where it's not yet a foregone conclusion, but it easily could be if we aren't really cognizant of what we're talking about. So yeah, thank you.
Well, you've kind of led very nicely into the bigger picture there, and I will come back to our other panelists in a minute. But Jim, I'd like you to sort of step in. Really, I have said before, and I'll say again, it frustrates me that a lot of people that are involved in agroecology are not quite as involved in understanding what's going on in terms of gene technology at the moment. And I'm hoping that what you will do is that you will bring us up to speed on what's coming, because it is, as Maiwa says, it's not just gene editing, and it's definitely not the genetic engineering that was in the early 2000s. So give us some context.
Sure, and I see no problem with people who are hands in the dirt with agroecology and farming not being able to spend time seeing what's coming, because it's a lot of work to grow food and feed people. So I don't think there's a problem there. But I can definitely bring from our research what we see coming. In fact, we've just published, along with IPES Food, a report called The Long Food Movement, which tries to look 25 years ahead and see what is the agenda that agribusiness has, and then how can we as agroecology movements respond to that. And the agenda that agribusiness has is, as we were saying earlier, this BioDigital Agenda. If we go back to, we go back about 25 years ago, we saw agribusiness was organizing around the idea of the life science model, putting together genetic engineering and pesticides and chemicals into one package. That model has sort of powered these blockbuster production of Roundup ready crops or BT crops, and these sort of single traits that they've attempted to sort of take over the market with. And that's been very successful for companies like Dow DuPont, which is now Corteva, Bayer Monsanto is now Bayer. It's allowed them to become ever bigger and ever more powerful. But I think we have a shift going on, a very big shift, in that those same companies are now mostly interested in the digital and becoming biodigital firms, that at the same time as they're developing a suite of new biotechnologies, gene editing is one, but there's also, developing microbes, genetically engineered microbes for the soil to change soil ecosystems, developing sprays, RNAi sprays, where you're spraying short strands of genetic material onto the crops or onto insects to try and interact with the genetics of the ecosystem. And then even these kind of really far out ideas like gene drives, where you're genetically engineering an organism so that its trait will spread, so that you'll not just change that organism, but you'll over time change an entire population on the field. These genetic interventions, one of the things that's very similar about all of them is increasingly they're less about the crop. They're less about creating one breakthrough crop, but about changing the agroecosystem. And I think for agroecologists, that's something to be watching for. In some ways, it's learning the lessons of agroecology, that it's by changing the web around our food and trying to control the entire ecosystem that agribusiness is trying to shift food systems on the ground. But more importantly, agribusiness is very interested in data. That whether it's Bayer or Corteva or John Deere, they're establishing these huge data platforms. They're giving them to farmers pretty much for free to take large amounts of data, soil data, weather data, seed data, production data off of the farm, and then sell back to the farmer prescriptions based on artificial intelligence on how they should farm. And as you scale that up, you see this kind of large-scale digital farming of large areas of the country, of the world, and then that data becomes the lever by which they can begin to, manipulate the market, control the market. So the coming together of the bio with the digital, you see it very specifically where a company like Bayer will take data from the farmer. They will then sell back to them these prescriptions on how to farm, and those prescriptions will increasingly be based on these tailored interventions. And those tailored interventions will be buy this gene-edited variety, or use this particular RNAi spray, or use this particular set of microbes for your soil. So it's not one blockbuster that everybody's going to get, like Roundup Ready. It becomes this multiplicity of tiny markets and niches that they're building their power over. So I think that's the shift, to becoming these biodigital giants, controlling biological interventions in the ecosystem and controlling the data. And just to put a footnote, right now we're talking about Bayer, John Deere, Corteva, but who's really coming in behind is going to become the big player in agriculture is Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Alibaba. We're going to see digital giants who we think of as internet giants becoming the main players in agriculture.
I wonder how our two farmers on the panel respond to that. I wonder if either one of you would like to have a go.
Yes, of course. I think Jim has laid it out nicely, but let me just add something from the on-farm perspective. There's a difference between the big data that Jim is talking about and precision technologies. We, for example, let me just, I won't go too far down this rabbit hole, but I'll just say on our on-farm experience, we're of course farming in an industrialized context, so we use machinery, we, because we don't use chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, we have on-farm weed problems. The way in which we cultivate lentils, for example, is we do in-row cultivation, but that in-row weeding requires a GPS system. So we use precision, GPS precision technologies. And that's in some ways an interface between high tech on the one hand that is data driven and technologies that are not data driven but rely on GPS. I'm just posing this because these technologies are, as Jim has clarified, very, very sophisticated, but there are differentials there that we have to take note of.
Okay, Chris, any thoughts?
Yeah, I just had a couple of thoughts. I mean, it was really interesting hearing what some of the other panelists were saying earlier about the, you know, putting this into a much bigger sort of political and historical context about, you know, who's at the table, how is the structure of the decisions made at the table determined, and you know, the kind of whole global history of agribusiness connecting with colonialism and so on. Because I think, you know, listening to what Jim was saying, one of the problems is so much of this sort of contemporary agricultural debate is presented in terms of producers and consumers. You know, it's very, very sort of decontextualized from local and historical contexts. And as soon as you start talking about producers and consumers, you know, all of these technologies, they seem, you know, quite positive and benign. You know, it's just helping farmers to produce, you know, things that consumers want, or, you know, keeping food prices down. So, you know, I think one thing is we really need to put this into a kind of food sovereignty context where people locally start thinking, you know, where does my food come from? Who is producing my food for me? You know, what are the what are the issues that I, you know, thinking of yourself not just as a sort of passive consumer of food, but that food is this, you know, this fundamental political business that's on our plates every day. And the other issue, I suppose, so many of these top technologies are always about reducing labour input. I mean, as I've been sitting here, I've been watching outside my window, like various of the people on our small farm going to and fro to the gardens doing stuff, whereas just about every other field around here, there's nobody in them at all. You know, there's a tractor every once in a while. And I think, you know, the other kind of political narrative is that nobody wants to farm. We need to get, you know, it's almost the only sort of sector of the economy where it's regarded as like, you know, the less labour involved in it, the better, you know. Whereas, you know, certainly my experience is that so many young people, for all sorts of reasons, you know, much more so than even, you know, 10, 20 years ago, so many people are getting interested in farming and food and wanting to, you know, to be producers, you know, at whatever level, whether that's a amateur backyard level or a commercial grower or farmers. So, you know, there's a whole kind of labour question that, you know, that I think we mustn't let slide. You know, we mustn't let the sort of big biotech narrative get hold of that labour question and sort of seed this narrative that nobody wants to farm and it's all about, you know, it's all about the technology and sort of getting labour off the farm, because absolutely it isn't.
I'm really struck by how how the sort of tech narrative wants to simplify everything. We see that a lot in science, not just agricultural science. You know, you get rid of all the externalities and you just look at sort of discrete pathways of things. And the thing about farming and food production is that it is a system. It is interconnected. It is sometimes messy. And so I see that a lot with the people that we talk to in our own discussions, that that they want to sort of get rid of all the messy stuff and just focus on, okay, there's a pest, how do we get rid of it, rather than look at the sort of larger network. So I wanted to shift a little bit, and I'm aware we're clipping through this a little bit, to Chantal, you mentioned your paper. You and Francesca did a really interesting paper, the links to which are in our chat here. And I wanted you to explain a little bit more about that, because you didn't just find that there were no compatibilities between, say, CRISPR, which was your example, and the 10 elements of agroecology, but you sort of found that there were difficult places within that comparisons. There were mostly there was incompatibility, there was some compatibility, there might be some future compatibility. So talk us through what you found and why you think it's important to this question of transition. That's open to both of you, by the way.
Sure, thanks. I'm happy to get us started, and I'll let Francesco probably answer the more difficult bits. But as I mentioned in our paper, what we did was we offered the 10 elements of agroecology as one framework to assess new technologies. I think the reason, maybe to backtrack a little bit first, the reason we drew on these elements is that unlike other technological assessment frameworks, when they exist at all, they're determined using these highly collaborative and participatory methods. And given what Maiwa, given what Nere said about the importance of how we understand and how we define research, science, innovation, these 10 elements were determined really using the experiences of academia, of civil society networks, of intergovernmental organizations, farmers, the private sector, indigenous communities. So I think they did a really decent job trying to represent the reality of global systems with the issues that concern the people that are growing our food. Understanding, of course, that any global tool will probably have to be fairly big picture while leaving some room for regional specificities. But I think just given how comprehensive these elements were, that's why we thought it would be good to use these as a ready-made assessment tool to look at new technologies and practices. And as you said, the thing is, when we did look at current technologies and specifically CRISPR under this lens, we did find them wanting to some extent. And I think if I can just also say that when we go back to the issue of assessment and path dependency that Maiwa mentioned earlier, if we look at current assessment tools, we're looking at very narrow indicators of what a successful technology would be. So if we're just looking at yields, perhaps, if we're just looking at short-term gains, if we're just looking at a technology's ability to specifically suppress a parasite or a pest, of course, we'll see that these technologies work. They undoubtedly work. But if we look at the whole system, as we've been talking about, if we look at the impacts on communities, on decision-making, then we come up against some real issues. So perhaps I'm pointing to the negative bits of the assessment first, but the real issue is that when we have the assessment tools we have today and we use those, we're sort of defining any technology as a kind of silver bullet solution that appears to answer specific problems in the food system, rather than asking ourselves the hard questions and looking at deep structural change. And I think one thing that's a bit unfortunate is that it's easy for policymakers to pick up on these technologies because they're a quickly purchasable solution. They don't tackle the deep structural issues, and it's almost like we're celebrating the Band-Aid instead of really being preventative and taking care of the symptoms that are at the root of our problems. So yeah, I think that half answered your question, but I know that you also wanted to look at the ways that these technologies might be compatible. So perhaps I'll pass that part over to Fran.
Thanks. I'll try a way around this question because I don't think we are the experts with Maiwa in this call. I just wanted to bring some other elements that I was thinking. I was just kind of responding to the question. I was just thinking maybe we should see the. So I'm really in a conversation. I'm really openly sharing my thoughts. Maybe we should see agriculture and innovation at somehow like as we see the food pyramids now. You first have, I don't know, let's say we have the basis of human rights or really general principle we should always have in any sort of development pathway. Then we have the basic agroecological practices, the one that, I mean, is not even, maybe we shouldn't even call them agroecological. I mean, indigenous people, as Maiwa said, and as we probably, we all know, they've been using like what in French is called also bon sens paysan. It's just a way of doing farming in a sort of intuitive and smart ways, or like intercropping and integrated pest management and so on and so forth. So all the basic agroecological practices that have been described by Altieri. And then we sort of add layers and we see at the end, what do we still need? And if there is place for some things, and I do think and agree with Nettie that we do also know to a certain extent, in certain circumstances and situations, some digital technologies, I mean, they can be very powerful and they can really help. I see that, for example, here in IFAD, of course, they use lots of them, and for good reasons. Some not always, but that, for example, GIS, of course, is a very powerful tool that can be used in a lot of different situations. But maybe there is this pathway that we sort of have to follow. So we start from, okay, let's first apply the basic agroecological principles. Then let's add, I don't know, some machineries or whatever we need for labor and tillage and so on. And then according to the agroecological zones and to the context specificities. And then let's see at the end what we still need. Do we need, or can we add drones? Can we add whatever else, or whatever precise technology? Is there a way to add that technology in a way that also respects like equity, the division of power, the human rights, and so on and so forth, that empowers the farmers and sort of the basic principles that we always have to follow. And then I think that the problem with GM, again, not being an expert, is that it sort of wants to solve problems that we need to solve with other things, with that precise silver bullet, of course, and it fails. And it's like it is a technology that could potentially be used in a number of situations, but the problem is that it's in direct contracts with a lot of those principles, with a lot of those practices, and also for a matter of opportunity cost is actually not the good one. It's not a matter of liking it or not. When I was an advisor of the Belgian Green Party, people wanted to know the position of the party about GM technologies. And my advice for the member of the parliament was, well, actually, I don't think we should be interested in GM technology, because it's just not, we are not in favor, we are not against, we are just not interested in it because it's not delivering the answer we are looking for. And we have much better solutions that are much more cost efficient, that are much more interesting, and that are the right one for the problem that we need to solve. It's really, I think, a matter of identifying the problems that we need to solve and then finding the right tool. And this, I think, is in this broader thinking that with Chantal we have worked at this paper. It's like, how do we assess then what is the right technology for the right situation? Let's try to find a framework that help us to make this happen, to make this sort of differentiation. There was also, when we were writing this paper, that indeed the discussion about the HIP report on agroecology and other innovations. So the question was, okay, how do we assess the other innovations? Because of course, I think biotech and definitely lots of other technology were also part of that discussion. So I think, getting back to my first idea, I think that maybe if we see agricultural development as a sort of food pyramid, but we first get the basis, we first get the vegetables and the fruit, and then then we can still, of course, eat a bit of meat or eat a bit of something else, and in a probably smaller amount and in certain circumstances. But we can't base our innovation, our farming system into a technology that should be used probably at the end of the spectrum, not at the very beginning. And this is also the problem, I mean, with GM, is that we are starting by using those seeds that are already modified, that we don't we cannot control. And I very much agree with Nettie in her first intervention that we just don't have the knowledge to assess those technologies. So it is dangerous. And so why are we taking that risk? And then I just wanted to drop another little bomb. I think that one of the problems that we have to solve is, okay, we know Jim mapped very well the current situation, how and where companies are going to concentrate power. I mean, of course, we all know they want to increase profit, and they are going to do it in any possible way. And it's fantastic that we have people like the Etc. group that are working on keeping track of that, because it's indeed very time expensive. But how do we solve that? And we know that agroecology is a solution to a lot of problems. But we also know that agroecology is doing something very revolutionary. It's actually providing farmers with low tech or knowledge intensive solutions that do not require money, that do not generate actually economic exchanges, or much less than chemical farming. So is in direct contracts with the current economic system. So I think that one of the biggest questions that I have is to what extent can we compromise? To what extent do we think that we can actually fight the current economic system, capitalist system, with agroecology? Or how much can we actually compromise and introduce some and actually acknowledge that indeed within this economic system, we do also need to justify from an economic perspective, also including the inputs in the farm level, the sort of economic growth that is expected from a farming system. So it's really a question. I don't have the answer. It's really where do we draw a line, and how much can we compromise, knowing that pushing for the pure agroecology paradigm is going directly against the current economic system. So either we address that question, either we are going to, unfortunately, I think, to fail, but I think we are able to address that question. Over.
It's interesting that we always ask, where do we have to compromise? And the fact is that if the future is a plurality of systems, everybody has to compromise. The people who are pushing biotech have to compromise if that's the kind of system that we're going to have. And so I think it's really important to ask, certainly, where we draw our lines, but actually everybody in this conversation needs to ask where they draw their lines and what limits can be put on things. And in fact, I think the only farming, the type of farming that puts limits around itself at the moment, legal limits, is organic. Organic says we will go this far and we will go no further. And very, very few other types of farming do that. So how do we get to that stage? What steps need to be put in place in order to provide a kind of, I see the inverted pyramid as agroecology on the base. And if you like, more tech is at the top. So what steps do we need to put in place to get there? And I'll open that to anybody.
Can I just say something that's not so practical, but more wide-ranging about that? One of the steps I think we have to take is to reassess how we view people of the land. I'm just struck by a recent intervention to the 48th session of the Committee of World Food Security, where the US delegate very specifically said, we want to abandon, in fact, we reject the language of peasants. And I think that's significant because it in some ways draws the line to how we see ourselves. And it's very difficult for farmers to rename themselves when renaming ourselves as people of the land, as people who practice agroecological, integrated, holistic farming methodologies and are socially engaged with that. It's very difficult for us to locate ourselves there if that language and that location is denigrated, and the language of peasantry, of being people of the land, is an insult. Okay. And this is in a global conversation from one of the most powerful agriculture actors in the world, the USDA. So I think one of the things when you ask the question, where do we compromise? How do we make whatever you'd call them, trade-offs or adjustments? One of the places where we shouldn't make adjustments is we should continue to be very clear that if we don't consider ourselves people of the land, and we don't consider ourselves as embedded in these ecological systems, then we will not make judgments, good judgments, in terms of where the limits are, because we're outside of them and we will not see where the real limits are. I'm not sure that's helpful, but I just want to put that language piece. Let me just add one other thing as farmers then. It's very difficult for us to critically assess new technologies if every such critical assessment is already denigrated as us being backwards and not up with the times and ignorant and so on and so forth. All those insults that are, according to the US intervention, part of the problem. It's very difficult for us to be critical and to say, actually, we're rejecting those technologies, because that puts us in the camp of the ignorant, the backward.
Thank you, Nettie. Chantal, you wanted to say something, and then Francesca.
Sure, thanks. I wanted to sort of start relating this to policy for a moment. I think it's really the issue that Francesco raised and that Nettie just pointed out really clearly, that I think there's a lot of policy right now that's sort of trying to play this double game, which is really impossible to play. We can't be having policies on the one side that are very supportive of the conventional system, usually through subsidies, et cetera. And then on the other hand, having these smaller amounts for agroecology, for organic, that really don't do justice to the amount of support these systems need. If we really want to scale them out, if we really want to scale them up, and we want to make this the new dominant pathway. Because as Francesco said, we are going down a specific path. We want to try to change course. But if you're continuing to feed that path on a daily basis through policy, through through the private sector, et cetera, we're not going to be able to veer at all. So I think that's something that we should be mindful of when we're setting policy, when we're trying to speak to policymakers. And again, it's something that we're seeing, as Maiwa said, play out in Africa. And I know West Africa a bit better, but we're seeing that play out in West Africa specifically, where the sort of double track is being taken in the EU as well, which is very progressive on issues of agroecology and organic. And yet, a huge amount of funding is still going to systems we may not support, perhaps amongst the panelists here. So it is something that we need to consider and look at a bit more closely. And just to conclude, I'm seeing some comments from Hans Herren in the chat. IPES Food with BioVision, I think who Hans is with, published a report on money flows. So how much agricultural research money is going to agroecology compared to conventional systems in Africa. And the amounts were just completely lacking compared to the worlds of funding that goes to conventional agriculture. And as we said, once you're down a certain path, a lot of things have to shift for us to be able to change. It's research money, it's subsidies, it's really the whole system. But I'll end there and actually share that report in the chat.
Thank you, Francesco, and then I would like to get into some audience questions, please.
Yes, well, I just very much agree with Chantal. I think that there is a big problem indeed of how much the current policy system is feeding the industrial food systems and chemical agriculture, and how much this is also sort of distorting the real impact that agroecology has, and that we can see in a lot of different contexts. And this is a big problem, and we all know that. In Europe, there are the biggest chunk, and is a huge amount of money, is 1/3 pretty much of the EU budget, which is going basically to feed industrial agriculture, which is also going into research portfolios that are actually mainly reinforcing the industrial food systems and industrial production systems. So this is of course a huge problem that we need to face. And again, as I mentioned briefly before, I think there is another conversation that we need to have also in the agroecology. The people that are studying and working within agroecology is, are we able, and maybe it's not even a matter of compromise. I mean, for organic agriculture, there was at some point a big shift towards a regulation that sort of allowed subsidies and specific policy instruments and intervention to go to reinforce and strengthen the organic movement. Are we able, and do we see the same necessity for agroecology? Of course, we always want to separate agroecology from organic, because agroecology has no regulation, is not regulated. So of course, when you also are compromising at that level, then you are also going to generate some problems. But I think that's a very important point. I mean, if we want to support agroecology, knowing that one of the big problems of and one of the big lock-ins and limits to the transformations that we need to see in industrial food systems is because of the subsidies and because of the policies that are actually underpinning those systems, then we also need to find a way to sort of transform them, to get rid of them if we can, and then to use those subsidies and that public money for actually creating public goods. So I think that there is a big, there is a conversation that we need to have around what are the policies and how do we design policies that can support agroecology? How do we translate agroecology into policy? That's I think a big topic. We are seeing also in the European Union recently, and I think it's positive, that one of the ecosystem of the eco schemes of Pillar 1 is actually supporting, proposing to support agroecology. So it's starting to, in Uruguay, in Brazil, we have policies that are starting to design a support for agroecologists. But again, there we need indicators, we need a framework, the 10 elements, the tape, the sharp, and all these tools that are developed by the FAO as well. All this can be used for designing and shaping policies that are supporting agroecology. That's I think a very important and again, yeah, a question that we need to ask ourselves, because of course, when you have a regulation, then you're also sort of generating some problem. Over.
Okay, so just a quick update. We can go a little bit past our planned end time, so we are going to get our questions in. Chris, I think you wanted to interject something quickly.
I mean, I just wanted to say, you know, I think it's important. You know, we tend to think of the sort of mainstream industrial framework as being a very privileged and one that, you know, that we're outside, or, you know, certainly from my perspective on the farm, which is kind of true. But I mean, I think, you know, so many of these policy frameworks are based on a whole tissue of assumptions that I think we're seeing changing before our eyes. I mean, you know, we're talking about the sort of EU as we just were, you know, obviously being, here I am in England, you know, there's a whole kind of Brexit context where we're sort of split between sort of this narrative of national self-determination versus desperately trying to make trade deals. You know, in the meantime, we've got sort of climate change issues, energy futures issues, you know, huge political and economic tensions. So I think, you know, the moment we assume that there's some kind of stable policy framework within which the agroecology movement has to orient itself, you know, that policy framework, you know, is being torn apart by so many unpredictable forces, you know, that again doesn't answer the question. It just complicates the question as to, you know, what, you know, how do we orient ourselves to a, you know, to a deeply unstable and fundamentally changing world.
Yeah, I don't think we should be afraid of the fact that it's complicated. I think it's about time we started getting complicated. So I'm going to step back now, and my colleague Lawrence is going to put some of the questions that have come up in the audience and try and sum up what is quite a lively chat as well. Lawrence.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. It started slow and now it's happening, and I'm lost. I can't keep up with what's happening on the questions in chat. We also had a few comments and questions before the session started, so I'm trying to work those in as well. One early question was from Bill Grayson, which was relating to the UN Food System Summit. And his question was, is this summit just a cover for the big farming and corporate system? And that started pretty much early in the discussion, but there were a number of other questions and comments that kind of relate to that, which I just want to kind of capture under that big question. So I guess the question is, you know, is there a chance of working with these existing systems like the UN Food Summit? Several people made the point, okay, technologies are not neutral. Yeah, that's pretty clear. But again, is questions and comments that came throughout the thing. Does this mean technologies are not neutral, that they are always subjected to different worldviews and different sets of values? And if that's the case, how do we move forward? Are we forever going to be in a conflict of technology and values and worldviews that would be reflected in, for example, the UN Food Summit? Because for a number of people, that doesn't seem a very viable way forward. Or are we looking at the development of a totally separate, discrete agroecological, or whatever you call it, organic farm system, which serves as a reminder, as a conscience, or something to the mainstream system? So are we in a development of something separate, discrete? Are we in a conflict situation that will repeat itself from the World Food Summit and onwards and onwards? So Jim, you have your hand up there.
Can I just say,
good.
Sorry, I missed Maiwa wanting to make a comment, so make sure that you get to Maiwa after Jim, please.
Okay.
I just wanted to talk a little to the Food System Summit. I'm sure others will too, because many on this call are actually very involved in the discussions around this. You know, I think there's a few things to notice about the Food System Summit. First of all, it is a response by agribusiness, by the World Economic Forum, by others, to the growing power of the discussion of agroecology in the FAO and the Committee on World Food Security. The fact that these kind of more, this way of looking at the food system is beginning to become more significant within the FAO is exactly why you have this push for this Food System Summit to shift things somewhere else. And the somewhere else that those pushing the Food System Summit and creating this it's a narrative, it's attempt to change the narrative. That's what the Food System Summit is. What they're trying to change back to, but also forward to, is around the biodigital agriculture. It is around this idea of breakthrough techno-fix innovations, and which breakthrough techno-fix innovation can we focus on to stop looking at the big picture, and to keep with the same broadly broken model while seeming to rearrange the deck chairs of the specific technologies that we're using. So it's absolutely relevant. You know, I think at the heart of the push behind the Food System Summit is an attempt to shift the governance to allow, whether it's gene editing and the biotechnologies or the digital technologies, to have a new context. Because if you do have a growing support for an agroecological approach in the FAO and in the Committee on World Food Security, it becomes harder and harder to justify all these specific interventions. There needs to be this shift. So I think that's what's kind of going on with the Food System Summit.
Anyone?
Thank you. So yes, the UN Food Systems Summit is coming up. It in some ways is already happening underfoot. The thing in October is sort of the finale, but what we're seeing is this sort of, I think, a world shaping that has to do with a dismantling of the multilateral governance system, an instantiation of public-private partnerships and multi-stakeholderism. I'm very interested in the knowledge politics. So upcoming in July, there's going to be something called the Science Days, and they have panels stocked with experts to talk about their vision of the future from a science frame, even while they're saying that the dialogues can include all the indigenous peoples and all the farmers and et cetera. We must listen to the science. And one of the things that I have found very challenging from an agroecological point of view is playing this very, I think, strategic epistemic dance where we're trying to both affirm that agroecological is scientific, it's based on evidence, it's based on lots of peer review research, and to challenge the baselines and the boundaries by which we say this is what knowledge counts. You know, this is the kinds of expertise that we legitimate. We need to expand those concepts of knowledge and expertise to practitioner, to embodied knowledge, to indigenous. And I loved how Nere put it, like, not forget that we are people who live in and with the land, which is this ontological shift, which I don't know everybody's ready to go there, but I see that we are sort of on the back foot sometimes when we bracket the conversation as like technology assessments of gene editing or agroecological criteria to assess technologies, because those are always other people's technologies. And we are then in the almost the defensive posture, and we're always negative. We're always then critical. We're always having to say, I hate this, it doesn't add up. But what about technologies that are reflective of and produced by people who live in and with the land? You know, to begin, I think ETC Group has done some really interesting work on wide tech and thinking about technology in the way that links past, present, and future, and isn't always kind of this digital space that is always bound up in property rights. So that's sort of, I don't think we have had that conversation yet. I'd love to think further with these people and everybody about it. So I'll stop there, because I don't think we should cede the territory of technology, but we've got to really crack open the process.
Chantel, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, just to add to those two really, really great comments. I think, as we said, the issue is really, it's really a governance issue. It's a paradigm choice issue. And the summit initially bypassed, and to some extent is still marginalizing, not just ideas and paradigms, but also bodies that already exist to govern global food systems in a more participatory way. We've talked already about the CFS specifically, which again was set up for the very reason of allowing for more participation, allowing for more conversation. So again, I think it's pretty flagrant how much the summit has shifted governance away from the CFS and these bodies. And when you look at, as everyone said, when you look at who set the rules of engagement for the summit, we see what their plans are. I think it relates to a question I saw in the chat also, asking the panelists to talk about some of the compatibilities between gene editing and agroecology, because we've mentioned them loosely, but we haven't gone into the detail. And just to touch on that really briefly,
I was going to actually bring that up next. So
sure.
you can start. Let me just frame that, because several people talked about in the conversation about sound science, and you know, the concept or the idea, the notion of sound science, the kind of magic wand notion, the silver bullet notion, is little more than a power play. On the other hand, the view that knowledge is now separated, it's in little boxes, and we need maybe more wisdom than knowledge. But set against that, or maybe the people who are asking the questions about genome editing are actually also trying to see genome editing in a wider context, within the wider frame of sustainability. I think the two people or three people who made the points and the questions are coming from that background, that they find it hard. They're working towards a more sustainable system, a more democratic, responsive system. So what is the problem? They would like to know. So Chantel, please.
Sure, thanks. And the reason I was relating this to the summit discussion is because, again, for me, the fundamental issue with this is the paradigm we choose and the governance behind it. And I think in Francesco and my assessment, we did see, as someone mentioned, some compatibilities between CRISPR and agroecology, specifically on very, I would say, agronomic issues, if I'm not mistaken, Francesco, around efficiency, potentially around recycling, potentially to a limited understanding of resilience. But in some ways for us, the final conclusion, perhaps foregone conclusion, was that all of this was a bit irrelevant to us, because when you are so narrowly defining what technology is, what science is, what knowledge is, and which ones matter, we're really talking about very limited successes and things. So again, I think these areas of compatibility might be interesting places to start up a conversation between agroecologists and those perhaps more in favor of technologies or biotechnologies. But to some extent, I think they unfortunately don't, we need to confront these paradigms for a reason, because if we look at the bigger picture, the compatibilities that we found were perhaps less relevant.
Okay, does anyone else want to say anything on that specific point about GE in agroecology or the incompatibility? Jim?
Well, I really appreciate the question. I think comes from Amrit about, well, these technologies are part of the evolution of plant breeding. They're not a silver bullet. They're just part of the toolbox. And I think one of the, when in policy fora, when we engage in conversations around genetic engineering technologies, around synthetic biology and CRISPR, very often what we do hear from agribusiness is, look, this is just, it's just one part of the toolbox. It's just, we have to consider each of these on a case-by-case basis. We have to, you can't make broad speculations. You have to think about each thing very practically, one at a time. And I think part of the conversation we're having here is that technologies don't work like that. You can't just take one part of a technological platform and say, well, this specific use I'm good with, like this specific app on my iPhone is good and it helps me, without looking at the wider technological platform and the changes that that's creating in society and culture and in economies and so forth, and obviously in this case agroecosystems. What I continually see, certainly in these conversations, is that when the proponents of this technology, the developers of these technologies, the investors of these technologies want to move forward this vision, and it is a vision. I think that's the other thing to say. They'll happily talk about an integrated vision for biodigital agriculture, and then when we come to talk about the technologies, we'll say, no, it's just a specific thing. It's just one tool in a toolbox. Well, it's not. The toolbox exists in a wider context. But they'll often try and focus on down and try and hide away the wider conversation. But tools bring politics. I think that's something that keeps coming up here, is, the tools bring a wider politics. They enable an economy, they enable cultural shifts, and you have to look at the wider politics of those tools in assessing. I guess it's important to make that claim, and that's why we need technology assessment. The technology assessment has to be able to formally ask the bigger questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. That's very good, because it actually leads on to, I was trying to work out how to bring this in. We had, clearly, technology is not neutral, but technology doesn't necessarily, the question about, the tool in the toolbox raises the issue, whose tool in whose toolbox? And the toolboxes can be the ones who want the existing status quo. The toolbox can be somebody who wants a little bit of modification of the status quo. Right to the other end, the toolbox is somebody who wants major transformation of society as a whole. Now, we had a question before we started from someone who is an organic farmer. He actually came up with a term I hadn't noticed before, which is an OER farmer, organic, ecological, and regenerative. Did not use the word agroecology or agroecologist. Chantel used the term about just now, that we who are agroecologists have a different view, a broader view and a wider view than other people. Okay, where does that fit with the people who want change, but maybe not want the major total destruction of our market economy system. And but buy into, they do really like and want to follow some aspects of what the system change, total transformation change agroecologists want, but don't want to go that far. So when we talk about non-neutrality of the technology, whose tool in whose toolbox, who are we actually talking to with this? I mean, where do these people who are not into total system change fit within this kind of movement? Anybody?
Maybe briefly, I might turn back to Francesco's pyramid, which I quite liked the idea of, in that we have this kind of deeper foundation of something that we can all agree on. I think whatever, I don't want to say that there's sides to this debate. There are, unfortunately, but there are certain principles I think we can all agree on. Good, responsible governance. We want resilience. We want efficiency. Again, if we take the 10 elements of agroecology, they're quite clear. I don't think anyone would dispute wanting any of these. And if we could come to some agreement on what all of that means, on top of that, when needed, we can turn to some of these technologies we've been mentioning because they do have benefits. Maiwa also mentioned in the comments all the idea around open sourcing of technology. So, the more we move these technologies towards sort of the agroecological paradigm of good governance, of participation, of inclusivity, then I think, we're definitely having a more productive conversation. Perhaps I was taking the first stab at this, hoping that others would intervene as well, but yeah.
Well, I think this was maybe some of the things that Francesca was talking about in terms of the compromise area, or let's not use the word compromise, let's use the word area of overlap. Is this, do you see this happening? I have some specific questions about this, where a couple of people who are very, very concerned about animal welfare. And we, the question that Nere Weave put up on the chat about livestock breeding, and she's a long-term breeder of livestock from an organic perspective, and is very well regarded in UK farming circles, but very much rooted in organic agriculture and the right kind of breeding systems. But her concern is that the claims for people using genome editing for livestock breeding might produce results which are not publicly acceptable. So the question relating to that is that should one of the touchstones or benchmarks or checks on this assessment of what is a good technology be public acceptability? And if it is public acceptability, what about when public acceptability changes? Because public acceptability is not a uniform thing. We also had a previous question, also with livestock, where intensive chicken production, at the moment, all chicks, the female chicks are useful, the male chicks are not. Therefore, there's mass slaughter of all male chicks. Now, some people who are wholly into animal welfare, full of compassion about animal welfare, believe in massive system changes, see that is an aspect of genome technology which actually can be of major benefit in terms of animal welfare, in terms of bringing about major changes in industrial systems. And they would find that in that case, the technology would gain massive public acceptability. So two sides of the same coin, and please can you comment? But it's no good in this case relying on the old thing of saying, oh, well, it all depends on world values and world views, and we need major system change, because both these questions come from people who recognize we need major system change, but they're facing these problems now. So
can I just jump in here?
Yes,
let me just
please.
say that as someone who was in the early conversations of coining the whole term of food sovereignty, one of the pieces that we were very clear about is that food sovereignty means that peoples can control and the public acceptance is in fact not globally based, but is in the hands of those who are producing and eating that food in local and regional areas, okay? So food sovereignty in some ways speaks to this question of public acceptance. Who's in control and who it doesn't. But can I just say something else about this whole question of how we assess technologies? I think that one of our key assessments in the background always is that whole view of efficiencies. And what I'm hearing in this animal genetics question is also, how can you efficiently just produce what you're actually going to need and abandon producing what you then just have to slaughter, okay? A lot of our conversations are around efficiencies. And I didn't coin this, but I firmly believe that efficiency maximizes catastrophe. Because efficiency often actually is shaped by narrowing down to a small set of purposes that which is around us. And that's actually countering diversity. And if we're going to live successfully and in regenerative and happy ways with very complex ecological systems, we're going to have to abandon this view that we get to direct and decide what's efficient and what's and reshape our environments on that basis.
Jim, in a second, could I just ask for clarification, because I think I may have missed it. That last sentence, you said we have to get to decide what is efficiency, not someone else. Is that the point you were making?
No, we have to abandon the view that efficiency is always shaped only to our human short-term selfish project. Okay.
Thank you.
It's an ethical question.
Yeah.
I was reflecting, Lawrence, on you were asking this question around public acceptability, and you know, that's a term that comes from marketing, right? Talking about public acceptance and so forth. And I don't think public acceptance is the basis on which we would assess technologies. This notion that you produce something and somebody else accepts it or doesn't accept it, like the sort of transactional, we can get away with this. I found myself thinking around, you know, in technology assessment, many of us push for participative technology assessment, ones where the assessment is being done by different publics. There's not one public, and it matters because there's different power differentials there. We can't just have the powerful majority determine what's acceptable, because there are smaller groups within society who can be very marginalized, and often they're not small in number, they're just small in power. But you know, if you go back to, I'm a big fan of the Luddites. Some of you are there in the UK. The Luddites 200 and something years ago who tried to, you know, slow down the initial industrial revolution in the UK because they saw technologies that were hurtful to the commonality. So their standard for technology assessment was the common good. Let's assess this against the common good, not public acceptance, common good. And then that creates a conversation that's really worth having. What is the common good here? And is efficiency in the common good? I think what Nettie's pointing to as efficiency may not be for the common good. It's for the good of those who want to sell, for example.
Yeah, Chris, thanks, Jim. I wholly give it for the Luddites. I'm certainly a Luddite. Chris.
I just wanted to make a quick sort of overarching point, you know, just thinking about what Jim was saying. I mean, you know, one part of this that is really extraordinary is that, you know, as Jim was saying, we're in this situation where, you know, a very small number of people are determining sort of technologies that kind of set the entire global agenda, and yet it's still framed in terms of this very kind of 18th century Adam Smith invisible hand of the market, you know, capitalism as a sort of, you know, competitive thing which sort of finds the most efficient system, and you know, clearly I think where agroecology has to come in and you know, is precisely to talk about diversity. You know, if we really want a kind of sort of efficient, competitive market system, it can't be the, you know, the kind of system where we've got the sort of four big corporate giants. And also, you know, that point about toolboxes, you know, there is this tendency to try and reduce every agronomic or every sort of food system problem to a plant breeding problem, you know, rather than social innovation, or, you know, there's a whole other sets of toolboxes. So, you know, I think that there's work to be done on sort of shifting the narrative away from that sort of rather comfortable Adam Smithian 18th century view of what's going on. And you know, that's, and you know, obviously the questions about animal agriculture, you know, it kind of feeds into all of these more specific questions, but you know, there's a job to do there.
I have one
Thanks,
comment
Chris.
on that.
Yes,
if that's
please,
okay.
Maywell, yeah.
This was my first year teaching an undergrad class in agroecology and food systems histories. And at UC Santa Cruz, most students are not convinced that we need to lock in the industrial paradigm. Like they are well aware that we need massive change, and many of them are very invested in social justice as part of that paradigm shift. I saw a very interesting sort of bifurcation in the class where a lot of students were very interested in lab-based cellular meat and plant-based alternatives to meat because they have read and understood the stories of the problems of concentrated animal agriculture. We talked about the connections to COVID-19 and the pandemic, and like, so they were very well aware that we need massive change to the way we farm animals now. The class kind of split along the lines of like whether the pathway we need is the cellular pathway or the agroecological one. And I found that very interesting because I think it speaks to some of the points we're talking about in this panel. Is like there are areas of convergence. Like we agreed that the CAFO model is a disaster for global public health, for ecologies, for human communities, for the livestock and the integrity of the animals. What was a harder lift for me was to historicize how industrial agriculture created this rift between livestock and land in the first place that broke these nutrient cycles. If we want to talk about efficiency, the most efficient thing you can do is to integrate and reintegrate the metabolism of nutrients returning to the land. And once students started to understand like, oh, we've done this historically, we can do that again. Maybe we can't eat 10 kilos of meat per day, but you know, like who said we ever needed to do that? And that was a very, I think, joyful moment for me, was seeing students start to understand the power of history and to see where we've come from into the normality that we currently accept, because the answers are there. They really are. Anyway, I'll stop there. I think the meat case is so interesting because it does entangle areas of, I think, convergence, and then what do we do about a problem that we understand needs to be solved?
Can I just ask you, Maywell, you have to go in 10 minutes?
Yes, please.
Okay, because I have a question. There were a couple of questions for Chris, and I wanted to get you to comment on them after he'd said his bit, but I'm now going to get you to comment on before he says his bit, so he can change what he's going to say if he wants. This is a question about scaling up. The question, a number of questions we had, it was about the desirability or the inevitability, or how tied in is the idea of small farms and small farming to agroecology, and what that actually means in terms of relationships with mainstream agriculture, and how applicable is it and where. That's a question for Chris, so you can think about that. My follow-up question was related to Maywell, the question of scaling up. And I think there's two aspects to this. One is the question of, which many people involved in agroecology are concerned about at the moment, is how to scale up, whether it's desirable to scale up agroecology. But you also have been involved in thinking about scaling up a technology, and the issue to do with how genome editing might exist in a smaller scale and whatever, but what it means something different if you scale it up and apply it on a bigger platform. And I think it would be good if you could just say that before, say a few words about that before you go.
Interesting. I'm not sure if I have been involved in scaling up technologies. I will say, just to kind of comment on how I think it connects with agroecology, is many people who I work with kind of have stopped using the word scale up because of its problematic reference into, like, we're going to reproduce the logics and processes and dynamics of efficiency and scale that are, you know, central to industrial processes. So we talk about like amplifying or massifying. There was a really good book on scaling in agroecology that talks about deepening. That's like deepening the practices on horizontal knowledge sharing, and then on connecting to policy and to social movement. So I think about kind of 3 axes of scale, and I don't use the word scaling up anymore in agroecology. If I think about that in terms of technology, I would say that scale appropriate is going to be important for me, and maybe this gets into where Chris is going, like the smallholder base, the relationships to organisms in the environment, to land-based communities and land-based knowledge making is fundamental. There are very interesting questions about how large you can get, especially if you give up the idea that individuals need to own property, because you can have a big piece of land and lots of people co-owning the land. We've kind of boxed ourselves into a fairly liberal orientation to individual property rights. So your land size determines your ownership. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Where I am from in Peru, Andean peoples, we collectively own and we have usufruct rights over land. So I think there's interesting ways to think about scale and extent that is separate from whether I own this piece. But yeah, I think that when we talk about technology in that framework, the most important thing to me there is what we've reflected on previously is getting the people who are sovereign to this land and to this food system to also affirm sovereignty over technology. Like for me, and I've been working on an article already along these lines, Jim mentioned it at the top of the conversation today, is working on technology sovereignty is a way forward for me to think about how agroecology is consilient with technology in the long and short term.
Thank you. So, Chris, several questions which were directed to you in relation to scale, the desirability of small farms and all of those relationships, whether you see small farms for example, in the UK, but in other parts of the world, as the basic model of an agroecological future, or whether we're just being sloppy and lazy when we talk about small farms and we should be actually talking about something else.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much do see small farms as the basis of an agroecological future. It does depend on the view you take about various larger trends, particularly I think energy futures and sort of labour futures. You know, the sort of whole model that we've become used to of industrialisation in recent centuries is getting people out of agriculture and employing them in industry or in other sectors that sort of generate more capital and more growth. I mean, we can talk about the rights and wrongs of that. My sense is that that's not going to be the model that we're heading to in the future. That we're going to be in a situation of energy squeeze and kind of underemployed labour, and in that situation, farms can potentially absorb a lot of labour in low carbon ways, and so getting that right politically seems to me the critical thing. And I mean, Maya was touching on that with I mean, I've written about sort of issues about sort of commons versus household farming and usufruct. I mean, yeah, perhaps we won't get into that now, but that is absolutely the debate that, property rights sort of linked to food sovereignty is absolutely the debate that we should be having, not, if there's some kind of plant breeding techno fix that's going to buy us out of this. In terms of scale up, I mean, I think just a final point on it, it's worth bearing in mind that we've only scaled up a very small number of crops. You know, I think it's like something like 75% of global cropland is devoted to 10 crops, you know, 6 of which are cereals, and the others are, you know, mostly grain, legumes and oilseed crops. So, you know, like mainstream agriculture has been very successful at scaling up an extremely small, albeit, you know, they're useful, you know, energy and protein dense crops. They're great crops in and of themselves, but, you know, we need to diversify. You know, that's kind of what agroecology is about. And particularly in the, you know, in the wealthy countries, you know, horticulture seems to me key. You know, we need to be thinking in terms of more fresh fruit and veg, you know, for a whole bunch of reasons, including human health and nutrition. That intrinsically pushes us towards more localized and more labor intensive forms of production. You know, at the moment, a country like the UK, we import most of our fruit and quite a large proportion of our vegetables, and that's basically to do with the kind of labor politics and you know, the price of labor and, you know, a whole set of political you know, inequalities around that. So yeah, so basically I you know, depending on the view you take about energy and labor futures and climate change, I do think it's about fundamental, you know, not entirely, and we can, you know, debate the levels and what does a small farm mean, and, you know, there needs to be some flexibility there, but fundamentally, yeah, I do see the future of agroecology being based on relatively small farms producing food for local communities, not producing a handful of, you know, very easily mechanizable and processable and transportable food commodities.
Okay, well, it begs questions about how you see agroecology and farm structures in large areas of the country, or countries like the United States, where you've got this vast, relative, very underpopulated areas in the Midwest, and land and so on that's geared towards some things. I mean, I know one of the bases everyone talks about, including me, by the way, about the need of appropriate cropping and appropriate structures and so on, cropping structures and structures of farms appropriate to the scale, appropriate to the ecology and the ecosystem and so on. But there is a big issue about how we get back from that. And those kind of issues are not actually necessarily addressed in terms of questions about transition to new things. I think we are coming to an end, Pat. I'm going to pass back to you just with 1 or 2 final comments from me and from the questions, and apologies to everyone who've made comments in the chat and questions that I haven't got to. One of the issues, right again from the beginning, can't read my writing. I think it's Roseanne said, agreeing with you, Pat, about the need to engage in the door. She said, if we don't engage, the outcome will be a foregone conclusion, which means, you know, how do we engage? What's the terms on which we engage? Are we actually looking at just saying we need a total transformation of society, because that's easy to say, or are we engaging on what is inevitably a conflict and a battle of altering the terms of engagement so that we can win over some things? And that's like a guerrilla warfare, which is therefore about transformation. And I do like Maiwa's idea about technology sovereignty. I think if we move towards the concepts, the ideas and the terms of technology sovereignty, we're making a significant step in engaging in this guerrilla warfare and altering the terms of the engagement. Anyway, with that, Pat, I'm going to pass back to you.
I think this has been an incredibly rich conversation, certainly one of the richest that I've ever seen. We've got another 5 minutes, and so very briefly before we end, if everybody wants to make 1 short comment, I would appreciate hearing from our panelists, because there's really not much I can add here. We'll start with Francesca. Short comments, everybody.
My God, that's a big responsibility. I think a lot has been said. I just thank everyone. I don't want to add anything at this point. It has been just great to be part of this panel. and to have this conversation. I really hope we will keep on working together, and I'm sure we'll be in touch to keep on developing the many interesting points that has been mentioned today. Thanks, Pat, and thanks for organizing this.
Maiwa?
Yes, thanks everyone. It's been such a joy to see and hear your thoughts come together in orthogonal but also complementary ways. I think in response, I'm processing this question about engagement and the various spaces that agroecologists and others are brought to engage with the question of technology. I'm thinking about the UN Food System Summit, and I think we have to be very mindful of the politics of that process as well. We're frequently invited in onto territory not of our own making. And so to the extent that we can reclaim that territory and define the terms of the engagement, this is the point of all those proliferating dialogues, right? These are the places where Indigenous folks are allowed to be, but this is not territory that they've shaped. And so I think in agroecology, being very curious about those invitations and the potential legitimation that we give to those conversations by putting ourselves into the space. It's not to say that there's not good things that happen when we get involved, but just to be aware of that. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been such a learning experience. Thank you, Pat, for all the organizing work that went into it. It is a lot of labor, so I appreciate that.
That's fine. Thank you. Chantal?
Sure. Yeah, thanks to everyone, and thanks to the organizers as well. And this is fully a personal thought, which I hope aligns with Maiwa's because of all the brilliant things you said. I don't actually believe that saying we need to change things substantially is easy. I think it's easy to say perhaps, but much harder to implement, but there are plenty of communities, leaders, unsung heroes that are already forging that path, usually at the smaller scale. So, I really welcome that kind of radical leadership and that radical engagement. And, perhaps again, easier to say than to do, but if we look back at history, moments of great change were often quite difficult. Rarely did they happen on the terms of dominant powers. So, just some kind of food for thought on how we engage, because I think concession is something that, often looks like compromise. So, again, these are questions we have to continue debating because I think there's a lot still there. But thanks again to everyone.
Thank you. Jim?
Thank you. I echo the thanks to Pat and Lawrence and those who put this together. It's been incredibly interesting listening to everyone and frankly looking at who's not on the panel but is putting comments in the side and is listening in. It's a really wonderful group of people, and I realize I'm missing in this pandemic time the chance to sit around and talk about these things with people I really respect. So thank you for making a glimpse of that, and I wonder how our movements can keep having these reflective conversations amidst this sort of rapid changes in governance that are going on. So it's an open question. Thank you.
Nettie?
Great honor to be part of this conversation. In terms of engagement, I think the work of movement solidarity, I'm part of Farmers Union and Via Campesina, we're very committed to working in solidarity across differences and cherishing our diversity rather than just tolerating it. So that's where we're located. I just want to say in terms of the World of the Food System Summit, as sometimes people set the table and they ask you to come and eat, but the fare is toxic. So maybe we shouldn't sit down there at all, but we should always cook well, eat well, set our own tables and invite everybody.
Thank you, Nettie. And Chris?
Yeah, thanks. Just to echo, it's been a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot from everyone's participation. I mean, my final comment may be just a very brief attempt to answer Lawrence's question as to, how we're in the, how do we transition from a situation with, like really rich agricultural lands like the North American prairies where there's virtually nobody lives, versus our overcrowded cities. I mean, I think that transition will happen, and regrettably it might be a pretty chaotic one, but I think it's just worth remembering that the original transition, the urbanization, didn't just happen by chance. I mean, there were peasant and small farmer movements that fought tooth and nail against what happened, and they kind of lost that time around. But the underlying issues haven't gone away, and maybe they won't lose next time, I hope.
Well, it's really up to me just to say that again, this has been a privilege to have you all here. It's been a fascinating discussion, and maybe we should make this a sort of regular meet. Maybe next year we'll meet again and see what's changed and what hasn't, and how we can set the world to rights. But I appreciate you staying with us for longer than we had intended, and I appreciate all the people in our audience who have stayed with us for longer than intended as well. Your questions have been fascinating, and we'll be pondering those for some time. So it just remains to say thank you. Please, we'll keep in touch with you, all of you panelists and audience, for more webinars, and we hope that you will join us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
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 Thank you.